Welcome to the great conversation where ideas matter. Ideas shape markets, but more importantly, ideas change the world. As you know, I have been all over the world dealing with my own episodes of risk and opportunity. And it's a dangerous world out there. And therefore, a state of mindfulness and awareness is absolutely necessary to not only take advantage of the opportunities, but to acknowledge the risks that are out there in the world. And there's a whole discipline around that in the risk, resilience, and security industry for high net worth and highly valued assets called executive protection. And one of the thought leaders in that area is a gentleman by the name of Michael Trott. And today we have Michael on the great conversation. Michael, welcome.
Ron, thank you very much. Appreciate you having me.
Michael, you'll read about him in my blog, but Michael is the Vice President of Global Safety and Security with something called Discovery Land. And he may touch on that and some of the things he's doing on there. But let's first back off a little bit, Michael, and go into your history a little bit. What's your background of knowledge that's led you to this point?
Ron, appreciate that. Good question. It all starts somewhere, right? For me, obviously, not obviously, but it does start with my military career, my military background. I think as a young, 20-something going into the military, most of us don't know exactly what we want to be when we grow up. Even I struggle with that at 59. But I think that opportunity at that time in the military is what got my head spinning about the security industry. I was part of the Air Force Security Forces. And while I was in that particular section of the military or the Air Force, it just wasn't enough for me. I wanted to do more. So I was quickly looking for other things to get involved with, which led me to other special teams within the security forces. And then quickly being reassigned from the U.S. to Germany. This was post, sort of pre-Cold War, before the Berlin Wall came down, and then also post. I was involved with some unique opportunities to get involved with protecting generals who were under threat from a particular terrorist group called the Red Army faction at that time. And if you kind of remember a little bit about the history, around the same time that the wall came down, there was a particular German banker by the name of Alfred Herrhausen who was assassinated. And that would have been my wake-up call, I think, to what I felt I was probably going to be doing for the rest of my life, and that's to protect people who might be targeted for assassination or other, types of risk. So that's kind of where it all started. And from there, about 10 years later, I had the opportunity to switch sides and run over to the CIA. And I was employed the CIA for many years and kind of continued my sort of a process of protecting others, and became an assistant team leader eventually with the protective detail for George Tenet at the CIA, both pre 9/11 and post 9/11. So that's kind of where it all got started, Ron, if you will. And that's 20 years of that particular type of DNA that kind of grows inside of you. And then I just kind of continued that for the next nearly 40 years after that. So that's where it all started.
And you also, it's consummated in a book you've written called The Protected, right?
That is correct. Yeah, that's a good point. So that's, I joke about it, but I think it's serious. To write To Protected was, 35 years of, somebody asked me how long it took you to write To Protect, and I said, well, it took about 35 years to write it. Because you do have to learn it, you have to experience it, you have to make the mistakes and learn from those lessons. So a lot of the content in that book did come from those 35 years. And, it is a team approach. It's all one team. So I was able to talk to a lot of my friends and colleagues who've been in the industry and kind of take some of their advice. And, before the book went to publish, I shared it with a few industry people to give me their honest feedback, and made some modifications and told a few stories that tell other people's adventures and their other lessons learned. So I feel it's a pretty comprehensive book for our EP industry today. But to be honest, Ron, I wrote it. The nexus for the concept of the book was to write something for the principals themselves. Because often these individuals are left out of the conversation, ironically. But they're the ones we're protecting. But they don't know too much about the industry, especially in the last 10, 15 years with so much new money, so much emerging threat and risk. And these young families and young 20-something CEOs and entrepreneurs and new billionaires, they migrate to some sort of form or program or protection, but they really don't know what it's all about. So after working with and for a couple of those individuals, I thought, we're missing the content to describe to these individuals what protection is about from an EP perspective. So that was the other reason for writing the book.
I had a great conversation with Max Segal, who runs the Honor Group in Europe. I don't know if you know him.
I do know him. Mm-hmm.
And we were talking about how interesting, this is serendipitous, but we were talking about how clueless, not because they're stupid, just because of time and focus and so forth, but how clueless HR teams, event teams, and the clients themselves are about what EP can and should be doing, right? And we're talking conceptually. It's so interesting that you said the premise of the book is for those clients to actually understand what's going on, because just like me being a medical patient, if I don't take ownership of my own health, then I'm just following instructions. I'm relating to tactics, and I'm not strategically looking at my health. The same thing with EP. It sounds like what the protected is really making them part of the journey of keeping them safe.
And they should be first and center, foremost in that thought process. You're absolutely right. There's not a CEO out there who would venture to get into business at a product or a concept or an idea without knowing the total, workings of that process and understanding the risk to the failure of that new company or that widget they're making. But yet, when you turn to the protection of their life or their family, they tend not to want to get too involved with that, which has never made sense to me. So no, to your point, there's a lot of examples in the book. There's a lot of what I talk about is the human complexities of executive protection. You could say executive protection is just concepts and principles and policies and procedures all day long. And while there's a little bit of truth to that, it is such a heavily human involved art and skill. You're going to be part of this principle's most inner circle, and you're going to see some things that you can't unsee, and you're going to hear some things that you can't unhear. And you suddenly become part of the family and part of the entity. And even they're not aware that that's going to happen, but it's going to happen at some point in time. So it's an interesting topic. It's not just about the hard skills and the soft skills. There's the human complexities of executive protection. And as I mentioned, to one degree or another, probably it's the second oldest profession, because as soon as somebody in a tribe tens of thousands or 100,000s or millions of years ago, somebody was threatened by another tribe member, one or two people stood up and said, we're not going to let that happen to you. So the very thought process of protecting someone has been around for a long time.
Well, the practice has been around a long time. I remember Fred Burton and I talking about how he used to collect information on sticky notes and pieces of paper and try to assess the threats that are going onto his assets or his company or so forth. And so we've been at it quite some time. Basic assessment, basic awareness, basic situational awareness, tactics by which you would respond to a threat if needed. All those things have been in place for some time. And therefore, yes, I can see why you would call it the second oldest profession. But technology has a way of disrupting even the most loved and cherished professions. As you and I are going to be participating in a protective intelligence summit in Austin later in February. What do you see going on right now with protective intelligence that might be going through some form of transformation, even radical transformation, that you're seeing today with your perspective?
I would say to your point, it is radical within our particular private sector protective intelligence. If I went back, say, 20 years ago or more, the organizations like the Secret Service and maybe the CIA, we did have certain software and applications that we could use to help us analyze and kind of put in a machine learning component to the element of protective intelligence. But that was pretty much not available for the private sector, private families, or even Fortune 100 companies. So over the last, let's say, decade to 5 years, you've started to see some of that software sort of ooze out into the private sector. Still being extremely expensive and very difficult to really acquire for a small program that not only has a budget of $1 million or $2 million a year, when that particular software could be that much. So what we're seeing now, finally, and to your point, and Fred and I go way back, for many years it was just about that. It was about Post-it notes, or it was Excel documents that might have our POIs, our persons of interest, or our threats. Anyone who's made a threat against our principles, we might find what we can, collect what we can through our relationships with law enforcement, maybe even the early years of getting online, and we collect this information, but it still goes into an envelope or folder that goes into the desk drawer, and we don't pull it out again until that name surfaces again. Now we're seeing this transformation of having software and tools like OnTick and others that are coming out with that is just honestly mind-blowing and taking us into a whole different new direction in terms of being able to understand the risk, to analyze and navigate that risk, and to share this information in real time and to monitor it real time, which we've never ever had before. So it is an exciting time in our field with that kind of information. But I also will say, if I could, Ron, I would add, it also concerns me a little bit that possibly some of our practitioners are relying too much on that information to tell you what to do, instead of going back to the old, gumshoe work that Fred would have done or I would have done years ago. You still have to put that human element into it. And sometimes our current generation, or maybe some others, are relying, in my opinion, too much on the technology. It's got to be a partnership. And hopefully that will adjust over the next few years.
I totally agree. I was fascinated because I was dealing with a robot manufacturer, for example, and I'd seen many different iterations of robots come out. And at first it was a robot, pretty much being operated virtually, if you will. Mm-hmm. But then some of the new models coming out have the operator at the end of the line actually interacting with people through the robot, and that augmentation gave a deeper, richer touch point, if you will, to the interactions. And I think we're seeing that everywhere. I think we're going to have to bring that human element into it, but at the same time, we're also dealing with an explosion of information over the last 10 years, sources of information that would augment your insights, your situational awareness, your understanding of the threat. So I guess the secret sauce is going to be, how do we take advantage of what technology can do, which is give us a lot more information that can be digested with ML and AI tools quickly, and still bring the human element into it to enrich it. Do you see any techniques or words of wisdom on how that might be done?
I think, to be honest, that may be one of the stumbling blocks, in my opinion, because I think with the different software and technologies coming out, it is processing much faster than any human can, and it is sort of delivering information that has to be seen by the human's eyes to a certain degree. Because at the end of the day, if a threat comes to a protected detail, since we're talking kind of specifically the EP stuff, if it's delivered, it sort of surfaces, the flags go up. You still have to get in touch with either law enforcement, someone to now take it to the next level. Because every EP team doesn't, operate autonomously within the law. You still have to now apply the law to some of these issues. Can I go knock on a door? Can we go conduct surveillance? Can I ask, law enforcement to conduct a 5150 kind of a psych eval on somebody I think is a concern? If I think he's a concern in Alabama, but I'm sitting in Arizona, can I tap into legally the airline or rental car industries to understand, is this individual on his way from Alabama to me? So it's still emerging. I think there's a lot more handshakes that need to happen in between different technologies. And then we're still going to have to skirt the line of the sensitive question of privacy and how much can you glean from this kind of information. If you look at active shooters at the synagogues that we've had and churches and schools and buildings, every time one happens, almost every time when it happens, we're like, we knew that was going to occur with that individual. So then it tells me there's a gap between the information we're receiving and working with law enforcement to stop it. Or if it's a personal protective detail, we have a concern. Now we have to scale up a few more people for the residential protective detail, or put out some more surveillance on our patrols or on our motorcades. Whatever that human component is, the technology is not going to do that for you. So we have to work a little bit more on the handshaking.
How fascinating, though. I think you just nailed something. Again, I've been around technology all my life, right? And technology usually has a laser focus. It's going to a particular problem at a particular time and hoping for certain efficiencies. Mm-hmm. And in this area, though, if you need an integrated approach to collecting as well as digesting and assessing before you can take appropriate and efficient action. So to the degree an OnTech-like company can bring all that information together faster and yet distribute it in such a way to HR, legal, IT, compliance, it's going to make you more effective and timely on your actual response. Does that make sense?
100%. I'll give you another little example to a small degree. There's a particular software that is very robust, very capable, and it works in the physical threat as well as a cyber threat. But it was designed mostly for the cyber threat world. And this developer's a friend of mine from Europe. And but he developed this basically hanging around at MIT and kind of working with some different programmers. And once the system got out there, it was extremely successful in the cyberspace. But in my speaking to him, he goes, Mike, this has an application for what you guys do. How can we tweak it? How can we use it? And we started looking into it. And it already had the tools that we could use in the EP space. So, I was going to certain big companies that I knew that they were using this software. And I'm talking to the EP teams. I'm like, hey, do you have access to this particular software? And they're like, we don't have that within our company. I go, no, you do. Your cyber guys have it. And they're like, we didn't know that. So then you go to cyber guys and say, hey, do you share this software with your EP guys on a physical protection for your facility and the executives? And they're like, well, no, we've never used it that way before. So I think to your point, there's certain, unless it is a product driven for, I would say, sort of the personal protection to stop active violence or active shooters or executive protection, which I'll give OnTech a hand. That's what they're focused on. It's got a lot more capability, but it was delivered into the physical security world. And now that is beginning to come alive in this ecosystem. And we're quickly getting up to speed of how to use it versus a lot of the software, as you would know, was developed many, many years ago about the big threats to cyber. And that's where a lot of the emphasis and a lot of the money, the US government put a lot of money into that to develop that, and it's sitting behind those walls, but it never got over to the physical side. So I think we are I think the doors are cracking open. We're beginning to share information. And I'm sort of motivated to see now that, companies like OnTick or others are beginning to open and crack those doors. And now we're sharing information from all the different sectors of HR, cyber, whatever that may be within that company's operation. So I think we are getting better at it for sure. And unfortunately, every negative event happens. I think there's we step back and look at the lessons learned, and we develop tools and pathways to make it better and to have more handshakes within that organization.
One of the, when I was the CEO of a company and I would gather my team together, I had the VP of marketing, VP of sales, I had legal, I had accounting, I had IT at the table, I had operations, supply chain. And I had these people at the table. It dawned on me one day that it was kind of like the United Nations. They all spoke different languages.
True.
And I had to be the guy in the room to translate.
The interpreter.
Because otherwise we wouldn't see the big picture, right? And what you just said, it kind of is a microcosm of that. If you think about it, when it comes to physical security, cybersecurity, executive protection, when it comes to these things, the more we can have the machine, if you will, learn our practices and act as almost a stimulus for human augmentation of that data too. So instead of relying on the physical security guy to walk over and ask HR a question, but especially when you're right in the middle of a situation, wouldn't it be better if you got prompted and said, this is a possible privacy issue. This is a possible EHS issue. This is that it could be really interesting if we start getting that kind of computer assist, if you will, in helping us talk to each other inside the company.
100%. 100%. And I think to your point, I think it is happening slowly. I think we touched on robots earlier before we started the podcast. And, robots are also another good way to see this handshake that I referred to. And I joked a little bit about it in my book about the future of executive protection, maybe another 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road, could be sooner. But I do see the android robot individual who looks just like pretty much like a human sitting in the executive's office or the suite, who's sitting there to the side, if you will, and sort of greeting with that, and that's fine. It could be that kind of robot voice. But what you're doing is you're now starting to see this AI see so many different interactions a day that is human, that it will begin to learn, and it will begin to send almost human-like notices to key people that, hey, this person, with facial recognition, he's on the BOLO list. He just walked in. Somebody needs to know about it. So I do think we're getting closer to the two working together hand in hand. And I think maybe, to the earlier point, when a lot of this software came out in the cyber world, it was really the cyber people quickly seeing the red flags, doing their X's and O's and coding and stopping threats. And they're doing it in their own little ecosystem. But now that we see this software have a broader approach to stop, which is the whole purpose of it, to stop a horrible act from happening, it's got to happen faster. And as humans, then we have to respond quicker. And that's where I think we're getting better, but we still have a ways to go.
Yeah, that's very. For those of you listening today, Mike and I will be at the Protective Intelligence Summit hosted by OnTick on February 21st through 23rd, and I'll want to be asking all sorts of questions about what's front of mind to Mike, because it's much beyond what he's just doing at his current position. And I can't wait to learn more about what is stimulating you into the next 10 years of your life, Mike Trott.
Ron, I appreciate it. Look forward as well. That'll be a great event and some really smart people there. And I always enjoy sitting in the room people that are much smarter than me. It's just fascinating to hear. And Ontic does have a great group of minds. So Austin's a great town as well. And look forward to seeing you next month.
This has been a great conversation with Michael Trott.